Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Wildland Fire Preparedness Forum, and I wanted to introduce Ken Cox of the MNRF, and he will be driving this presentation, as well as Dan Chumley, who is the fire chief from Dysart, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. And we have a number of our members online right now. I've opened up the waiting room so people will just join as they can. But to respect people's time, I think we'll get going. We are recording this, and this will be posted for the people that can't attend. Okay, and quite a few people are coming in now. So, Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can get started.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to speaking about Wildland Fire to you all. And as I go through my presentation, I hope you find that you have questions. And on the next slide or two, I'll probably answer those questions. But if I don't, make sure that you keep them in your mind or write them down. And at the end of the presentation, we'll definitely have time for a good discussion on Wildland Fire and anything that's outstanding that I haven't talked about. So my name's Ken. I'm your Southern Region Fire Advisor for the province of Ontario. My role is predominantly educating folks on wildland fire. I've been a wildland firefighter for 17 years now. That's kind of scary to say, but I'm going into my 17th year. Doesn't feel like it feels like yesterday I started. It's been an amazing career, lots of journeys. If you know anybody at all that might be looking for a career stepping stone or starting off for a summertime position, our fire rangers, it's an amazing job opportunity that they get to see all across places all across Canada and North America and fire response. And I hope to get one or two from your community here shortly. Just to do a spot check, Sharon, I want to make sure that you can see my screen and you can hear me 5x5 before I go on too long.
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
You're good.
Well, I like to start off the presentation with a map of Ontario, just to show you who my team is. I want you to all know who the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry is and how we partner with your local fire services, such as Dysart et al., Highlands East, Algonquin Highlands, Minden Hills, just for the Haliburton County aspects of things. But in all, the province is a fairly large landmass. North of this squiggly black line that I drew here on this map, this whole area is called the Inside the Fire Region. And the Inside the Fire Region of the province of Ontario is governed by the Forest Fire Prevention Act. So here in Harcourt, where you all reside, it's governed by the Forest Fire Prevention Act. That's a ministry provincial legislation. And then you're also governed for outdoor burning through your municipal bylaws. So for those of you that are in Dysart et al., it's the Dysart et al. Burning bylaws. And for Highlands East, it's the Highlands East burning bylaws. And I say that too because I know there's some folks here that might be joining from the general area that might have seen this advertised. So that's why I kind of speak to not just the one municipality, but the other neighboring municipalities as well. Now, on this map of the province, you'll see all kinds of red lines. And what those red lines signify is a response sector. And each response sector has a fire management headquarters, such as here in Haliburton. So I exploded the view up of the map on your right side of your screen, and you should see Fire Response Sector EO1. That's here. That's Southern Ontario. And Haliburton Fire Management Headquarters, right here at Stanhope Airport, where I'm presenting from. That's where we hold the crews and equipment to adequately respond to a normal fire load within this geographical region that's highlighted in red. So if anybody called 911 to report a forest fire over here by Renfrew, not only is the Renfrew Fire Department responding, but also the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. It's on our radar because we're partners with them. Vice versa, all the way over here to Tony Van Dam over in Georgian Bay. They get a call, we respond, and we support them. And of course, locally, we're right down the road from Fire Chief Dan Chumley and Chris for Dysart et al. And Highlands East as examples here locally. We're only a 3-minute flight away from supporting Dan and Chris, as well as Chief French over in the Algonquin Highlands side, and all the other local municipalities. So if you're ever driving by Stanhope Airport and you look on the north side of the airport road, you see that great big gray building. That's where I am right now, and that's where we hold the crews and resources. Now, you'll notice we don't always have helicopters on the tarmac here all the time, and we only have helicopters and aircraft here when the hazard warrants the need for them. If we're soaking wet, but the other side of the province is super dry, the majority of aircraft and the majority of personnel migrate. We send them, they're mobile resources. They get sent to the areas of highest hazard. So when Haliburton's super hot and dry, kind of like it is right now, and we're experiencing or going to experience a lot of fire in the landscape, but Red Lake, super wet. We'll pull crews from Red Lake, Pickle Lake, Geraldton, all the way down here to Haliburton. They'll stay at the Pinestone or they stay at another motel, and they'll respond to fires with our Haliburton crews out of Haliburton. And you see, that's important because fire load is dependent on the weather and how dry the forest is. In 2023, all of Canada's forests were escalated, were very dry. And so every single wildland fire agency, and of course, every municipality fire agency was escalated in terms of response. But typically, somewhere in the province or somewhere in the country is wet. And then those wet spots send out their resources to the high dry spots so that we can match the fire load in the geographical region. Pretty cool, pretty interesting. We don't just have it set up that way nationally or internationally in terms of Canada, but we also respond and assist response for Montana, Idaho, Oregon, the northern states, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Costa Rica. There's a tremendous amount of other international agencies that come and support us in our endeavors in Canada and North America for wildland fire response. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years, within 5 years, you would have a Mexico fire TAC team coming through and staying in Haliburton FMH again, just like we did in 2021 and 2018, for examples. Pretty interesting. Now that's the broad scale. That's how my team at the Ministry of Natural Resources broadly has resources come in when we need them and whatnot, or exports. But locally, our response is broken up in municipal protection areas. And this is all free online maps and whatnot, but not that they mean a whole lot to anybody other than me and Dan. So when somebody calls 911, doesn't matter who you are, where you are, it goes through the 911 dispatch CAD system right now in place. And that call is going to go to the local municipality as well as the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry down here in Southern Ontario. So when you call 911 to report a forest fire, you don't have just one agency responding typically to the forest fire. You often have two. If Dan receives, as an example, if Dan receives a call of a wildland fire, he'll ask dispatch to make sure MNRF has been notified, and vice versa. When MNRF receives a call from maybe a passing London Flight Services aircraft overhead, they've seen they're at 30,000 feet and they see a football field size fire burning in the middle of the north part of the area in Dysart at all. Nobody's around to report it except for that aircraft. They call us directly. Right away, we're contacting Dan and or their dispatch to notify them of the incident so we both know what's going on and we both know which resources are needed to provide an adequate response to not just the landscape, but also you, the taxpayer. All winter long, there's agreements like this that are put in place between the mapping and the costing of who's looking after what area as a primary response. So we call that mutual aid agreements, for the lack of better words. And the mutual aid agreements, you might have Highlands East responding to fires in Dysart at all, but that's simply because the location where the fire department is in correlation to where the fire is occurring in the geographical area. That means that they're primary response and we're secondary, and vice versa. So we share resources like that all across the province on local scales as well. The tools that the MNRF brings to the table is primarily aviation assets and our fire ranger crew assets, but I like to talk about our water bombers, and this is one of them. The Twin Otter water bomber, you'll certainly see at some point scooping up off of Elephant Lake or any of the other lakes nearby. They'll scoop up, fill water in those pontoons, come around a circuit off the side of the lake and dump its load on the perimeter of the fire, trying to reduce fire's intensity. And here's a really good photo of that for a CL415. So some of you have probably seen the CL415 on the news. It's a staple point. It's what Ontario's and Canada aviation forest fire services are renowned for. And it's a huge asset to our operations. The CL415 can pick up 6,500 liters of water in under 12 seconds on a flat, calm lake. And its role, again, just like the Twin Otter, the smaller water bombers, to scoop up the water, come over a circuit over top of the perimeter of the fire and douse that side to reduce its intensity. So you can see here in this photo is actually taken out of Kenora in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but anyway, I'm pretty sure it's 2012 out of Kenora. But here you got, regardless, wherever it's taken, you got 80-foot flame lengths coming off that 30-foot tall conifer stand. That fire is much too intense to put any of Dan's team members on the fire line or any MNRF boots on the ground firefighters is just simply too intense. The role of the water bomber, the air tac, is to come over, drop its load, reduce that overall intensity, not extinguish it, but reduce the intensity. So as our boots on the ground firefighters can go around the edge, contain it, and then work our way in and extinguish that fire. Sometimes it takes us 20 minutes to extinguish a fire. Sometimes it takes us 2 months to extinguish a fire. It just depends on how big it gets and how large of a landmass it encompasses. On top of water bombers, we also supply aviation assets such as helicopters, rotary wing. The EC-130 Eurocopter, you as Ontario taxpayers, you own 7 of them, and they're fundamental to our operation. So if you can think back to that map that I showed at the beginning of my presentation of Ontario, and you've seen Haliburton plopped in the middle of southern Ontario. Well, there's a map of southern Ontario behind me, but that's a large geographical region to drive to, right? It might take us 4 hours to drive over to Renfrew, and then another 4 hours from Haliburton to go all the way over to the North Bruce Peninsula. It's much too long to drive with a fire apparatus. We still have fire apparatuses, but they're follow-up. Primarily, 9 times out of 10, we're responding to helicopters. And why? It's because of a quick response. It allows us to depart Haliburton and go to whoever's calling us. If Dan's calling us, we're only 3 minutes away. We're right next door to Dan's area. But if CFB Petawawa over on the Ottawa River calls us, that's a long drive. That's 4 hours of driving, but we can be there in under 40 minutes with the helicopter. And that's key. And it gives us a quick one-strike concept, but also it gives us an aerial platform. So if you can think, when you drive down the side of the road and you see all the forest there on the side of your highway, you can't see that far into it, right? Same thing applies when it's on fire. For ground agencies to arrive to a fire without being able to see the whole forest line and where that fire is burning and what it's threatening, it can be very challenging. Dan's got a tremendous feat on him to have to do a 360, we call it, a scouting report. And he's got to basically scout out all around that fire to determine what he needs for resources and what they need for an adequate response. That's why the helicopter comes in so effectively, is because we got that aerial platform. Immediately we contact him on the OFM frequency. I can let Dan know, or any of our crews can let Dan know what they're looking at, what would they need for resources, and supply them with that guidance. Even if Dan doesn't need our assistance and it turns out just to be a small smoldering fire, we can help them locate that. And that's where the partnership comes in key, is us being able to get there quick, provide that scan report, and then having the fire departments, various, or First Nation communities, or Department of National Defense, you name it, whoever else is responding with us, having that workforce there, boots on the ground, to supply and complement that. Comes together very effectively, very efficiently, and we're pretty good at putting out fire in Southern Ontario with that method, and we have been for some time. Other aircraft that we utilize aren't yellow. We contract out upwards of 200 rotary wing aircraft a season, helicopters a season. Sometimes they can come in any shape and color and configuration you can imagine. Wildcat helicopters, here's an example. There's True North Aviation over at Muskoka Airport, small blue helicopter. You got Wilderness helicopters, all white. There's all kinds of color, shapes, and sizes of helicopters that we contract out. Essence is, when somebody calls 911 and we have a helicopter on alert, it's dispatched. Whatever the ministry aviation asset is arriving over top of the incident, they're going to be doing hovers. They're going to be looking at that fire, seeing where it's burning, what it's going to burn, where it's heading, and so we can make sure that we get an adequate response to suppress that fire or manage it on the landscape. So that's me. That's my team. That's what we bring to the table. And I got to mention too, that I didn't mention before, is that the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, as much as we're legislated for wildland fire management inside the Fire Region of Ontario, we're not by any stretch of the imagination the only entity responding to wildland fire. Like I spoke to, and like you've probably noticed, we got tremendous partnerships with all the municipalities, all the First Nation communities, all the Department of National Defense bases, CFB bases north of the fire region. There's a tremendous amount of partnerships there. Even local service boards, for an example, with fire departments. And the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, we'd be nothing without those partnerships. So it's hats off to them, hats off to the local fire departments that provide us the support when we need it. And we're happy to provide the support when we can and their endeavors as well. It's a huge team, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes besides just responding to a fire and putting wet stuff on the hot stuff. But that being said, so that's my team. But what does the fire season look like? So I like to talk about 2021, because 2021 was the busiest fire season we've seen in recorded history since 1995. And that's important stat because you can notice it's not just more and more fire on the landscape, there's trends. You're going to get periods of drought conditions, maybe a couple summers in a row where you get lots of fire activity. And then you're going to get periods where you get nothing but torrential downpours, nothing but rain events every third day throughout the summertime, and you don't get any fire starts, next to none. And that's the way it's been for my tenure in 17 humble years. And that's the way it's been for my predecessors' terms that I got to work with and learn from before they retired. One of the big takeaways is we see more extreme ends of the spectrum on weather this more recently. So you'll see very extreme dry trends, and then you'll get followed by extreme tornadic events and microbursts and cellular development. And I'm going to explain on how that occurs and how that affects fire behavior. But first, I want to talk about back to 2021 and say just over 1,200 fires occurred on the landscape. 78% of them were lightning caused, and 22% were human caused. That's traditional numbers for us, for the ministry. Those numbers are completely flip-flopped for fire departments. So for Dan and their team, predominantly 3/4 of their fires, very few fires will be, the majority of the fires will be human caused for Dan versus a fewer number of lightning. And that's because the sheer landmass that the Ministry of Natural Resources looks after that isn't next to human communities. We look after a tremendous amount of landscape that's very far away from human communities. And we get a lot of lightning strikes on those far north areas and far remote areas. And that encompasses, that's why our stats look like this. Whereas Dan's will look pretty much flip-flopped. Of the 22% human cause, that encompasses everything from trees on power lines, which is very common for us, structure fires that spread to the bush, car fires that spread to the bush, cigarette butts that in extreme dry conditions that can start fires, arson for criminal intent. Believe it or not, there's people out there with criminal intent that purposely light fires for criminal acts against the well-being of others. And of course, unattended campfires. Unattended campfires happens to be a cause as well. In all, for the ministry, we fully suppressed in 2021 just over 1,000 fires, but we also monitored and modified response, we call it, just over 140 fires. So what that means is, yeah, there's a fire occurring on the landscape, but we didn't suppress it. And that's important because fire has a very critical ecological role on the landscape of North America. If we eliminated fire from the landscape, we would effectively eliminate a natural disturbance cycle that many forest species rely on to cleanse the environment, to cleanse that forest ecosystem and kickstart it and allow forest succession to come back up through again. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more, but that's why. That's whenever a wildland fire occurs, we look at it, and if it's happening within means of threatening something of human value, and if that means it's happening south of Sudbury, it's going to get a full response. Pretty much any wildland fire that happens south of Sudbury is going to impact something of human value, whether it be private land, communication towers, hydroline corridors, railway corridors, road corridors, you name it. All kinds of human values south of Sudbury. Once you get north of there, you start to see more fires being able to burn freely on the landscape, given a specific set of strict weather parameters. In all, in 2021, we've seen just over under 800,000 hectares burned. You can think about that. That's about the size, just a little bit bigger than Algonquin Provincial Park in terms of a land mass in Ontario. So quite a bit of fire on the landscape. Here's a map for where they occurred in 2021. Lots of fire in the northwest part of the province, not so much down here in the south. And why is that? Well, it predominantly has to do with the fuel type. The fuel type north again of Sudbury, Temiskaming, over to Chapleau and Sault Ste. Marie, you start getting into that boreal spruce forest. Boreal spruce burns very aggressively compared to a deciduous forest like we have down here, which is primarily comprised of maples, oaks, beeches, elms, those deciduous tree species. That doesn't mean that we won't get lots of fire on the landscape down here. We certainly did in 2018 and of course 2023, like I'll speak to. But it just depends on the weather coupled with the fuel types. Let's talk about 2022 real quick. So you might have thought, and the way that the media covers everything and the way that society looks at fire, and we think we're going to get always more fire on the landscape, that's not necessarily true. And 2022 is a good example of a year that fell flat on its face because of routine thunderstorms and rainstorms that occurred that never allowed the forest to dry up to a state where it became lightning receptive. And that's key. So here on this map, you'll see only 275 fires in the province in 2022. Very low, well below average for us. And now we're going to talk about 2023, above average, slightly above average for Ontario. But in terms of Canada, it was record breaking. So to put it into perspective, Canada traditionally burns about 4 million hectares of forest a year from wildland fire. But in 2023, we've seen 18.4 million hectares consumed. So just over 4 times the amount that we regularly see on the land basin. And you've probably seen on the news, and you probably felt those impacts here locally when we're going to talk about the smoke. For Ontario, we're just above average. So we're actually able to export a lot of firefighters, a lot of equipment to BC, Northwest Territories, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and support them in their firefighting endeavors. Well, we still maintain a moderate hazard for the most part, just above average for us. So that being said, we got to talk about the negative impacts. And I know you all recognize that wildland fires obviously can burn infrastructure, right? That's what they do. They burn, they consume. That's the nature of fire. But another negative impact that doesn't get heavily talked about, except for because of last year, is the smoke impacts. Smoke from wildland fires can travel an immense distance, depending on their size and how fast the winds are pushing that smoke column. And in 2023, you all probably experienced just that. For all the folks I get to speak to in Southern Ontario, they always nod their heads when I ask them, were you impacted by smoke in June 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th of last year? And they all go, yeah, we seen it all right. And here's an example of why that occurred and why you got so much smoke down here in Southern Ontario. Actually, let me just pull up my laser pointer here real quick. I'm getting pretty handy at this stuff. Here we go. So after Halifax and the South Panhandle of Nova Scotia unfortunately experienced a devastating wildland fire event where they lost quite a few structures to a few fire starts there, a stationary low developed. And that low pressure system gave them a torrential amount of rain, but it also creates weather patterns that influx other provinces and territories much further away. What it did is it pulled cool, dry Arctic air from the north and pushed it right down south. What that did is it fueled the fires with cool, dry air. So dry air is very fire conductive, and it pushed that smoke right down south into southern Ontario. So each day, this is a burning period. This is satellite imagery that's free for anybody to see. It's on Zoom Earth if you'd like to check it out throughout this fire season. But this is a smoke column right here, and you can see the dark gray. Right here's where the fire's occurring, and here's the gray streak coming down. Same here for northern Quebec. And after you get a burning period, you get an accumulation of smoke that might travel, that might be 100 nautical miles long. And then it condenses and it gets thick smog, and it turns into smog as it goes further and further away from the fires. Traditionally, when these fires are occurring in northern Quebec and northern Ontario, like they always typically are, we have a lot of fire on the landscape every summer throughout this area. Usually the jet stream and the winds aloft carry that smoke out towards Labrador Sea, never to be seen again, never to influence southern Ontario. Last year was quite the anomaly in which this low pressure system pushed and pulled all that smoke down into, you guessed it, southern Ontario, hence giving us those smoke issues. Now, I can't come and talk to you about wildland fire and painting it in a negative light, because that's not the case. It's only negative, and it only has negative impacts really for us as human species. For pretty much all other species that call this great landmass and home, it benefits them either directly or indirectly. And here's some examples. So I took this picture in 2021 of a fire called Kenora 51. It's up on the Manitoba border. And here you have about 25 kilometers of flame front backing towards the Manitoba border. And it was a perfect opportunity to take a picture that's shown a 1980s burn. I had to highlight it because it's hard to tell from my photo resolution. It's just with my iPhone. But there's a burn here that happened in 1980s. And what you have there is you have a jack pine forest that's about mid canopy level. Jack pine is a species that has a serotinous cone that only opens up its cone if it gets subjected to about 410 degrees Fahrenheit. And to get to that 410 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty much you need fire 9 times out of 10. So when fire occurred here 25, 35 years ago, it opened up those cones and it started the regeneration of a new forest, a new jack pine stand. Here in this center of the picture, we'll call it old growth because I don't have modern records of when it burned last. But then I have right here on the right side of your screen a burn from 2012. And you can very much so still see that the canopy is very much so open. There's a lot of green herbaceous material and grass growth there. And these two old burns benefit species at different intervals. So the Kirtland's warbler, and don't ask me why, because I can't speak Kirtland's warbler, and I don't know exactly why it needs a jack pine forest 25 to 35 years of age to nest, but it does. So it only nests in those forests. And if you eliminated fire from the landscape, the indirect effect of that full suppression would ultimately eliminate this little bird's habitat in 25 or 30 years, 35 years. And that's important for us as wildland fire managers to manage, right? Because you can't have a species go extinct when you can manage fire in the landscape and allow it to have its ecological role. Same thing goes for woodland caribou here for north of Kenora, but it applies for white-tailed deer, moose, elk, black bear, you name it. Any species that benefits from fresh grass shoots and herbaceous growth, coming up with not an old growth forest, but a thick mat of fresh herbaceous growth. That's where these species thrive, and then they can retreat back to the thermal cover. And you get these different mosaic patterns of habitat that intertwine and interconnect after the years progress. Now you have this new fire coming through in 2021, and it might look like a wave of fire just devastating the forest, but that's not the case. There's a lot of pockets here that are left unburned. Some pockets are burned very severely, and those pockets allow fresh grasses to come up almost immediately. The pockets that aren't burned and have very little fire effect, those are the areas where wildlife retreat to and survive the passing of the fire. They've all evolved to live with fire over time immemorial, either through the natural phenomenon of lightning strikes or through the First Nation application of fire in the landscape. So pretty neat. I like talking about that stuff, but here halfway through, perfect timing. Now we're going to study the science of fire, and I'm going to hit you with the key messages on how you can alter fire's future behavior adjacent to your personal structures, because this is key. My role as a wildland fire manager is to protect and limit loss of human life, social and economical disruptions, and promote the ecological role of fire when beneficial. So first and foremost, I got to keep my people safe, Ontarians and people visiting the great province of Ontario safe. And also we got to keep your infrastructure safe, right? After that. So to understand how I do that, I need you to first understand fire and how I counteract fire, as well as Dan's team. So fires start because of three elements coming together. Wildland fires, not chemical fires or home fires. But a wildland fire will start because of heat, oxygen, and fuel. And heat might be that lightning bolt. It might be criminal intent, arson. It might be an unintended campfire. When it combines with oxygen and fuel that's dry enough to ignite, such as today, and it's a beautiful hot day today, you'll get flaming combustion. Once that flaming combustion occurs, you get the start of a wildland fire. Every wildland fire starts about this size unless somebody's throwing gas on it. Then you get a fire that behaves on the fire triangle, the fire environment triangle, sorry. And that's driven by topography, weather, and fuel. Topography is important for us, mostly for the Lake Superior coastline there up north towards Nipigon and Thunder Bay in Ontario, but we still have topography aspects here locally as well, micro topography. In essence, fires burn much faster uphill, and the reason why is because when you can think of holding your candle, if you have your finger on top of a candle, you can't get it very close to that candle before you burn yourself. Versus if you put your finger underneath the candle, you can get your finger a lot closer, right? Same thing applies to a forest fire when it's burning off a slope. It's convecting, it's releasing an immense amount of heat above it. And when that does that, it preheats the fuels on the slope above it, so it runs up the hill exponentially. Vice versa downwards, it burns much slower going down the slope because it can't preheat the fuels as fast. That's how topography plays in the fire behavior. Again, I won't talk too much on it because that's predominantly a Western Canada aspect, British Columbia, Alberta, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, but we can still speak to it here in terms of your full understanding of fire. Weather, huge common huge common variable in wildland fire behavior. So weather changes so often, and it's incredibly difficult to forecast. Us as humans, we're very good at looking at like a 3-day, 5-day range, Anything more than that, it's pretty much throwing darts at the wall, no pun intended. But if you ask me what the weather's going to be 2 months from now, I can't tell you. I have no idea. We got meteorologists that give us good models to predict maybe what we're going to look at. But the essence of it is inside of 5 days, even 5 days can be a stretch sometimes, right? When you look at the news and you say, oh, you're going to get rain, but then it ends up being a perfectly sunny day. That's the weather aspect of wildland fire that's incredibly diverse. And it's diverse on an hourly scale and even minutely scale throughout the day. Fuel, you'll see again. So fuel and fuel. If you eliminated fuel from the landscape, you would eliminate a fire from starting, but you can't do that because we live in an ecosystem that has tremendous amounts of fuel, and we don't want to remove all fuel because it's habitat for all kinds of species, right? But if you removed the fuel aspect just from the home, aka if you remove the pine needles and small fine fuels such as dead leaves from the rooftop, you eliminate the rooftop from being able to be ignited. I'm going to explain that in a little bit. Alternatively, if you eliminate forest stands adjacent to a structure, you change the way a fire burns towards that structure. Here's where we're going to get into the pickles of things. But first, I want to talk about weather. So here's a 14-day drying trend. And this is really important for everybody to understand in terms of fuel and how it dries out in correlation to the weather. So bear with me. On July of 2012, here locally in Bracebridge, these are the actual weather parameters that we had for July 10th right through to the 25th. And here you have a 15-day drying period. On the 11th day of the drying period, you got what we call problematic control. So it's red. I highlighted the bars here in red. And these are days where you now have a fire ban in place. The DAN, or the local fire department for your area, has probably issued a fire burn ban in this instance. On top of, if it gets real bad, the ministry will also put on a restricted fire zone. And this is why, because the forest got so dry that we're predicting a lot of fire starts. And to limit the amount of fires we have to deal with caused by lightning, will limit burning regulations so as we get less unattended campfires and less human-caused fires on the landscape that we can control. And you'll see here I circled 5 mils of rain. This little 5 here signifies that on July 26th, we got 5 mils of rain. A lot of folks think, well, we just got rain, so now the burn ban can be lifted, but it's not the case, because what happens is over this past 15 days, there's 3 classifications of fuel that dried out in the forest. We broke it down into. You got fine fuels, which are your pine needles, your dead grasses, your dead leaves, anything that's small and papery and brown. That's your fine fuels. You got medium coarse fuels that are about the size of your finger and a little bit bigger. And then you got coarse fuels, which coarse fuels are about the size of your forearm and bigger. So those large dead trees standing, right? Once the medium fuels and the coarse fuels dry out to a state where they get to a dryness level, they're not as receptive to water soaking them down to wet them. They take longer to dry out, but once they are dried out, they take more water to fully saturate them. And here's a prime example of that just happening. You got 5 mils of rain, so 5 mils of rain completely soaked the pine needles. But here's the thing about pine needles and fine fuels. It only takes 2/3 of one day to go from full saturation to combustible again. So in the matter of, it didn't quite work out that way because he still had a low day the next day. But the day after that, right back up to 90 FFMC. What that means is that's a high day. That's a very high to extreme day for us. And what happened is it only took 2/3 of a day for the pine needles and leaves to dry out. And the medium coarse fuels and the coarse fuels were already still dry. They didn't get enough rain to saturate them, so they automatically were already back at the high. And 2 days after that, you're right back into problematic control again. So when there's burn bans in place, we're not just looking at the rain we received, we're also looking at how that dampened the materials, the 3 classifications of fuel, but we're also looking at the forecast ahead of time as well. Because I think you can all agree on, it's very tricky to get that communication out there to everybody so everybody's on the same page, and you can't do that hourly throughout the day. It's got to be within about a 3-day window period before you change the scales so you can get everybody that's traveling through cottage country to know, hey, it's a high hazard, or no, it's a low hazard. You can't change it hourly. It's got to be given on a more uniform basis to make sure everybody knows what the hazard is too. And that's weather. Okay, moving right along. We're going to talk about fuel. So we can't change the weather, and I don't know what the weather's going to bring. For all intents and purposes, 2024 might be a super wet year for the rest of the season, and we might get nothing but rainstorms for the rest of the summer. I just don't know. We might also, on the other end of the spectrum, we might be looking at the start of a drying trend where we don't get rain. And we might have a lot of fire on the landscape here coming in the next few days. The essence is we can't change the weather, but we can alter the fuel right around your homes. And here's how fire burns relative to the fuel given a specific weather pattern. So on May 11th last year here in Haliburton at Stanhope Airport, the temp was 23, the RH was, the relative humidity in the air was 34, and the wind speed was 10. So what that means was it was a beautiful, clear spring day. One of those spring days where you look up and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, right? That gave us indicators that it was a high hazard day. So it's probably been drying out for about 4 or 5 days before this. If an arsonist would have taken a match and dropped it with intent in this boreal mixed-wood stand, that fire would have started and grown up to a maximum growth rate of 4 meters per minute. And that's Dan and our team working very aggressively to suppress that fire. Still definitely within our means, but we're working very diligently to contain that fire together as a team. If you put that same match on the same day, but you put it in this forest type, pure conifer spruce stand, you're looking at more than double, 9 meters per minute. And why is that? It's because of the arrangement of fine fuels. So if you look on the left and you look on the right, what stands out? The conifer, right? What's on conifer? Pine needles. Pine needles are a fine fuel. And here on the top right, they're arranged vertically and horizontally in a fashion that will promote aggressive fire behavior. Versus on the left, it's very broken. Yeah, you have a solitary conifer here, you got another pine here, you got another conifer here, but it's broken up. When one conifer catches on fire, it dies out and it doesn't go from crown to crown to crown to crown like it does here in the boreal spruce. Luckily for us down here in the south, in southern Ontario, we're predominantly made of maple hardwood forests that have mixed wood. Granted, we do have spruce, we do have pines mixed in within it, where we just don't see those kilometers upon kilometers and thousands of hectares of land of boreal spruce like you do north of Temagami and north of Sault Ste. Marie, for examples. That's how fire burns very differently, given the amount of conifer that's in the forest. Now, slash, and I'm speaking to slash because of storm aspects, and I think you all got some pretty heavy storm aspects there just a couple of days ago from the last storm that went through. So slash is unique because now you have an altered forest stand that's compiled down and not arranged typical fashion that you have a standing arrangement. You look 5 meters per minute. So why is it less? It's a conifer stand, but why is it less than 9 meters per minute? Well, it's because the fire's fine fuels are broken up by large boles of tree. So the fire burns the pine needles, hits the large bole of a tree, dies out, has to rekindle those fine fuels on the other side of it, and then continue to combust. All those little micro barriers of fire spread have a huge impact on how fast that fire moves through. That doesn't mean, even though the fire is slower, it's any easier for us to suppress. It's actually quite difficult for us to suppress because you can imagine climbing over this today with the temp being 31 degrees with a 55-pound hose pack on our back. Dan and I would have to climb up over all this debris to try and get to the fire's edge to try to extinguish it. It's very taxing on us. That's why we look at ignition operations quite often in storm damaged fuel types and fighting fire with fire in a safe manner. That's one tool that we can utilize. In Southern Ontario, it's hard to practice that tool, but it can be utilized for us if we need to. That being said, standing dead grass. You look at standing dead grass, and this number should pop out of you as a red flag, and I hope it does because 24 meters per minute is phenomenal. And why is that? Well, it's because of how fine that fuel is. If you think of a grass blade and you think of a pine needle, the pine needle is much more dense than the grass blade is, a dead grass blade. The grass blade, times that by 1 billion here in the photo, and you got a flash fuel type. So when a fire goes through, it preheats the next fuel exponentially quicker, and it's very quick, changes direction very quickly. It's the most dangerous fuel type we have as wildland firefighters, and it's just grass. Well, that surprises a lot of folks. Keyword here is dead grass. Once it's green, it's actually the reversed. This would actually become a safe zone once it's green grass and it's full of moisture. It's full of green, luscious leaves that are bearing a lot of moisture, simply doesn't burn. Same thing applies to our boreal forest. The boreal forest here for mixed wood content is a highest hazard in the springtime before you get that lush green growth on the deciduous trees. Once you get the green broad leaf component out on our deciduous tree components, it blocks the sun from preheating the forest floor. It blocks the wind from being able to affect and push the fire on the forest floor, and it holds a lot of moisture. It holds higher humidity in that forest tract parcel as compared to an open stand fuel type. So living in deciduous forest stands, a lot less fire conductive than a conifer stand, for example. So what do we do about that? Well, we can't change the forest stands because it's not practical. You can't change the millions of hectares of landscape. But what we can do is look at the homes and manage the fuel type and the forest type right around the specific home. And FireSmart Canada is a national program that speaks to that. It's used by Northwest Territories, right through to Prince Edward Island and everywhere in between. Every territory and province follows FireSmart Canada's principles. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about for the last 18 minutes. First and foremost, we talked to vegetation management, and vegetation is fuel. That's the forest. Anything that can burn in the grasslands, the forest lands is vegetation. If you manage that, you can manipulate the way a fire burns towards a structure without even having to wet it down. Pretty fascinating stuff, and it actually does work. I'm going to show you pictures here in a second. We also talked to development considerations on where new developments should be placed and where they should not be placed in terms of fire risk. Public education is key. It's one thing for me and Dan to know how we lose structures to fires, but it's another thing to educate everybody so they can use this knowledge and hopefully maybe see fit to apply it in one way or another to your lifestyle to have your structure stand a better chance of surviving the passing of a fire. Legislation applies for other provinces and territories, not in Ontario yet. But you'll see here interagency cooperation, cross-training, and emergency planning are mentioned. And that's exactly what Dan's team did, I guess, 2 weeks ago now, maybe even 3 weeks ago now, an emergency mock training in conjunction with us. We're nothing without our interagency cooperational partners, and we cross-train a lot with them and emergency plan with them a lot too, to make sure that you, the taxpayer, gets the best bang for your buck in wildland fire suppression. So I got to talk to you right now about how we lose structures to wildland fire. 90% of the time in Canada, structures are lost, whether they're homes, cottages, fire stations. They're predominantly 90% of the time lost due to ember and spark transport. So what that means is you can think the last time you had a campfire, and when you threw on a log, the sparks and embers came up, right? Well, they probably burnt out about 15, 20 feet up, and then you didn't see them anymore, right? Well, that's because the ember self-extinguished. In a forest fire setting, when you have, a football field size of fire occurring, that's a lot of vegetation being consumed. It's a lot of heat making convection. It'll lift and pull up larger pieces of debris, so large sticks. Pine cones is a really good example of an ember transporter. And it lifts those burning pieces of debris, let's say a pine cone for this example, and that pine cone, if it stays lit, if it stays as an ember, can stay and land on a receptive fuel bed upwards of 2 kilometers ahead of extreme fire behavior, but that's not the case down here in Southern Ontario. Down here in Southern Ontario, we often see within about 100 meters of a wildland fire. It's very common for us. We call it spotting. The fire spots ahead of itself and starts new little fires ahead of it. We deal with it all the time. But what the key essence is here is if the home is built up of fine fuels, so dry needles, dry leaves, small twigs, or grasses built up on the deck, under the deck, or on the roof fascias, those pine cones, as an example, would land on it, transfer that ember energy into a flame, and then that flame conducts more heat to the structure. So think of it this way. Think of yourself starting your wood stove fire in the wintertime. You've got to use paper, but then you got to put kindling, then you got to put on your medium log, then you got to put on your large logs before you go to bed at night, right? The paper is fundamental to start that fire. Without it, you're going to be standing there for a long time with your lighter trying to light the kindling on fire, right? Eventually it might go. Chances are you're probably going to be run out of lighter fluid before you can get those medium-sized logs or the kindling on fire. Same thing applies here in terms of increasing structural resiliency from wildland fire losses. If you eliminate the paper from the equation, aka in a wildland fire setting, the small wooded debris such as pine needles, leaves, grasses, small twigs, if you eliminate that off of the structure, those pine needles, or sorry, pine cones or flaming woody debris, when it lands on that, doesn't have anything to transfer its heat energy to, so it just burns out. And if you eliminate all those fine fuels on the structure, you eliminate fuel receptive beds for those embers to transport, and you save yourself 90% of the time. Direct flame contact attributes to about 8%. I think it's like 8.2 to be technical, but just over 8% of structural loss in Canada. And that's the forest, right? That's when you look at it and you say, oh, you know, that forest is only 20 feet from my home or 30 feet from my home. Those circumstances, the forest fire approaching a home and the direct flame hitting the structure only attributes to about 8% of losses. And then again, down to extreme heat, just around 2% of national losses from wildland fire. So extreme heat is at that 30 meter mark, or aka 100 feet mark, whichever measurement system you use. At 100 feet or 30 meters from a structure, you can have a full involved crown fire at fire intensity class 6. That's 5,500 kilojoules of heat. That's the most immense amount of heat you can get from a wildland fire. The structure will be saved at that point if it's separated that much. Any less than that, if it's like, 25 feet, upwards of 75 feet away where that's occurring, the radiant heat will have enough to shatter single window panes or melt soffit and fascia that's vinyl from the side of the home, exposing it to the ember transport. So even though they talk about extreme heat, the extreme heat actually catapults back to embers and sparks because it opens up the window panes and allows the embers and sparks to shoot into the home and start to combust the home from the inside out. Because sofas these days and a lot of building materials are made with accelerants and fire behavior aspects. So that's how structures are lost. And what do we do about that? Or what can you all do about it? Well, my key part in the job here for the Southern Region of Ontario is to educate folks on this and see if something like this can fit into your lifestyles in the future. So if you do anything at all after listening to me, it's look at your immediate zone, look at the home itself or the building itself. And if you can remove all the dead debris that's fallen on it from the forest off of your roof lines, paying special attention to connections right here in soffits and eaves troughs, and anywhere there's a dorm where a wall connects to the roof, make sure that's clear of fine fuels, buildup of pine needles or buildup of leaves. Because you eliminate that, when the embers land on it, again, they don't have that paper in the equation. It's like trying to light your kindling with your lighter. It simply is much harder for it to transfer its heat energy to. So you eliminate that fine fuel, you stand a much better chance of surviving the passing of a fire. Same thing applies for the decks especially. So decks are an important thing to look at. And it's not so much the top side of the deck, which is just important, but it's the underside of the deck. So if you can think of my deck, for example, it's closed in, but it wasn't always closed in. And what happened is it accumulated a lot of wooded debris, accumulated leaves, it accumulated building materials from other projects, right, that I stored underneath the deck. Well, then, of course, I catch on to things and I apply what I actually teach. But you remove that because what happens is embers, they travel a lot like snow ahead of a snowstorm. And I know that's opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's true. Ahead of a forest fire, if you see the videos from Fort McMurray or videos from Enterprise, Northwest Territories, Lillooet, BC, any of the other places that have devastated losses, you'll see those firebrand storms, and it travels like blizzards in a snowstorm. The embers collect the same way on your home and underneath your decks, the same way snow drifts will accumulate. So anywhere where you get snowdrift, that's where embers will accumulate predominantly, as a rule of thumb. So make sure that those areas are cleaned of any fine fuels. Then you can work your way out. If you did just the immediate zone of the home, making sure it's as non-combustible as possible, free of any fine fuels, you save yourself 90% of the time. Anything after that, working your way out, if you can reduce the amount of conifer around the home, that's good, but you don't have to remove every single conifer tree around your home. You can absolutely live with those beautiful white pine and red pine. I love them. As much as I make a living cutting them down, I also love them. And there's ways to prune them to limit the way they burn in the future. This is what this photo is going to show you. So you might have thought throughout this presentation, those are really cute, graphics that FireSmart Canada made, and where does it mean anything in real life? Well, I'm here to tell you it does mean stuff in real life, because in 2017, it was one example where I got to take a picture of it, which I was responsible for. So I was responsible for this home, as well as 6 others down the way here. A full crown fire approached it. The only reason, the sole only reason this home survived the passing of that full crown fire was because this person practiced fire smart techniques. Yeah, they're surrounded by pine trees, but what they did is these pine trees here in this example are self-pruning, right? These are from out west, but the same thing applies for your red pine, white pine here in Ontario. They self-prune. If you don't have any needles, branches going right down the forest floor, you separated that fuel continuity. So what happens? You have a full crown fire approaching the home. It goes, from crown to crown to crown, burning lots of material. If you kept the materials pruned, the conifer trees pruned and spaced, not deciduous trees. You can have as many deciduous trees as you want. They just simply don't burn nearly as much as conifer. But you prune the conifer and separate them a little bit, you effectively eliminate the chance for a fire to keep spreading. You take away its fuel, right, from the fire triangles that you learned about earlier. Fire's got to be forced to the ground. It only spreads on the ground. We live in Canada. You can't live on the barren landscape like in Sudbury, in the rock barrens. You got to have some vegetation around you, and that's fine. The key word here is to limit it so it's not built up. And the fire burnt a pretty moderate intensity right up here to the immediate zone. Then it self-extinguished because there was nothing fine fuel. There's no dead, dry, fine fuel here to continue its combustion. So you took the fire triangle and you broke it. Now you might think, well, what about the embers, Kenny? Because you taught us that 90% of structures are lost from embers, right? And you're right on the point if you're thinking about that. This structure is absolutely plastered. It was vinyl siding. It had burnt out embers embedded into the vinyl siding. Key thing here is the homeowner, before they evacuated, they had it all cleaned up. There's no fine fuels there for the embers to transfer their heat to cause more flame to then combust the home. The 6 other homes down the way here, they didn't have the same fate. The homeowners didn't practice fire smart and they were all lost in that example. And that's where it matters to me in my endeavors. So if you want to learn more, if this interests you, there's tons of tips and tricks out there from Fire Smart Canada. All you got to do, that's the French version. All you got to do is go on firesmartcanada.ca. They got tons of resources, books, and whatnot to give you educational pieces of literature to read and see if anything sticks with you that you would like to apply to your own homes. They talk to gutters, decks, eaves, vents, others, windows, what to look for, what to change out if you're doing things. You don't have to, Kenny's not telling you to go replace your perfectly fine brown pressure treat wooden deck with composite boards because Kenny can't afford, $148 composite 6x12 by 2 composite board. Those wooden decks are perfectly safe if they're kept up in good condition. Once they get to the state where when you walk on them, you could fall through them because they're coming pungy and they're getting lots of little crevices in them and cracks, that's places where embers will lodge themselves into and transfer their heat energy to, kind of like kindling as a source. But if the wood deck's in perfectly good shape, it's just like trying to hold your match to a large log. It just simply won't catch on fire. Here's things to avoid. Build up of pine needles on roofs, buildup of leaves adjacent to wooden structure items. Please try to avoid keeping your firewood right adjacent to your structure. Although the firewood is a large log, what happens is when you're piling it, the bark, the loose little tiny pieces of twigs and whatnot, they build up here. Sparks and embers can ignite that fine fuel and then cause these logs to combust and then cause the structure to be lost. Same thing here applies to this deck. It's absolutely covered in pine needles. On top of that, you got juniper, which is a highly flammable vegetation shrubbery. I would suggest replacing these with hostas and simply sweeping off this deck. It's going to save that homeowner a lot of grief in the future if it ever gets threatened by wildland fire. In the intermediate zone, working away from the home, look at herbaceous material to grow as opposed to coniferous material to grow. So again, look at changing out juniper bushes if possible with species that are more like hostas as the example. Other ways for tree species, look at maples, beeches, oaks as opposed to spruce trees. Here's a high hazard version of a tree that's got pine needles all the way down to the forest floor. When a fire comes through the grass here, hits this tree, it's going to fully consume this tree probably and cause an immense amount of embers and sparks and heat coming off of this. Versus this picture here, you won't even be able to get a fire to start in this short grass. But even if you did, it's not going to cause this tree's canopy to burn because it's deciduous. When you move away from the home, and yes, perfect, I got 4 minutes left. When you move away from the home, you can still apply the same things. You're looking at pruning conifer trees and possibly separating the crowns 3 meters apart. Now, that's not practical for all of us, and I fully respect that. If you do anything at all, just prune the bottom 2 meters of those branches. Create a separation, because if you create a separation here, the fire just continues to burn on the forest floor and passes the tree. It can't combust the whole tree because the pine needles don't reach all the way to the forest floor. Make sense? And that's fire. In all, your efforts in fire smarting your home help us. It helps Dan protect the home, and it helps the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry protect the home. We're definitely going to do our best to be there. We're going to set up exposure protection. Dan's going to set up monitors and values protection equipment, gelatin and foam. I'm going to set up sprinklers. That's my training. And we're going to coat the home down with as much water and cooling agent as possible. But the essence is, if the home hasn't been kept up free of flammable debris, it doesn't matter how much water I can put on this home. The deck, underside of the deck, probably going to shed that water. And if there's dry, fine fuels underneath it, I've still lost a lot of structures in my tenure that I care to mention from that. Even though I've put up sprinklers, I don't have enough time to clean up everybody's yard. I got barely enough time to put up sprinklers. So if you do your part, it helps me and Dan. Again, tips and tricks, go to firesmartcanada.ca, check out their books, lots of cool books, lots of cool literature to educate yourselves and see what you want to apply. Again, you don't have to. It's just me, my 17 years, talking to you about how you can possibly increase your structures surviving the chance of a fire passing over it. In all, I want to go from homes where I'm looking at this to this. And the reason why is because this is fine fuels all over the roof, all over the deck, all up to the home. If a fire is burning here, even at low intensity, there's nothing stopping it naturally from hitting the home. If you're away shopping, you come home and a fire is approaching it, there's little you can do to block it before it stops the home, even if you're home on time, right? And calling the fire department. By having a home like this, you can have a low intensity fire move towards the home and it self extinguishes before it reaches the home. And that's the takeaway. You can see here's a picture, the 1 minute to go. So here's a very intense fire. This is a fire intensity class 4, second highest ranking fire you can have, and it's right beside a wooden deck. Those of you watching, you don't have to answer me, but I want to leave you the question, do you think this deck lived or do you think it burned? And I'll give you the answer. It lived. It lived next to a wall of flame this much. And why is that? Because these deck boards are in good shape. They don't have fine fuels on them. There was no fine fuels for this flame to convect its heat to. It simply was radiant heat, and the radiant heat bounced off of it. So the deck actually lived, believe it or not. If it does interest you, you can check out firesmartcanada.ca too and look at the neighborhood recognition program. So for the first time in ever, this 2024 spring, the neighborhood recognition program, which Harcourt absolutely can apply for, is a $1,000 grant where you can host a community barbecue, get folks together, pay for the barbecue, and have a Fire Smart event where maybe you help some people clean up some aspects of their homes if they're elderly or in need or have disabilities. Maybe it's a good opportunity for young folks visiting the cottage with their grandparents or uncles or aunts or parents to help the community members out to do some of these chores, aka sweeping the pine needles off the decks and getting them out from underneath the decks. You do that, that's what this program is built upon, to try to get people, members of the community together to do that. And that is basically it. You can also help us by remembering to stay clear of water bombers. If you see us flying overhead, the water bombers, and you're on the waterway, please move to the lakeshore. And I only ask you that because we might be trying to scoop up off that water body. We can't pick up off a water body, obviously, if there's canoes, boats, or anything else in the waterway. We simply can't. It's too dangerous. That fire is going to continue to roll because we can't hit anybody with a water bomber. So please stay clear of water bombers. Also, remember that forest fires are drone-free zones. We also have to shut down our aircraft whenever we have a drone or an ORPAS, a remotely piloted aircraft system flying overhead without authorization. If we don't know who's operating it, we don't know what their intentions are, and we can't fly around a drone that's around an aircraft and a forest fire. So please do not fly your drones near a forest fire. And that's it. For more information, again, firesmartcanada.ca, check them out. And a really great tool for you all in terms of the fire risk and what's going on provincially. Check out, you can just Google the Ontario Interactive Fire Map. It's an interactive fire map that as soon as somebody calls 911 and I plug it into my database as a confirmed fire, it populates the fire on this map. So anybody can see the size, the status, and the condition of it real time as fast as I can plug it into my software. Pretty neat tool. Again, and then there's a federal hazard map too, which is slightly different algorithms of data. It's slightly not as accurate as the Ontario one, but I'm not nothing against the federal map, but it's still there too. And that's it, Sharon. I'm Dan. So I think
So I'm going to ask the question that we've been asked as the board of directors for Harcourt Park, especially after last year's smoke issues, is evacuation planning. And what do we do and how is that managed outside? Do we do anything, or do we rely on the MNRF and the local fire stations, et cetera, to manage that evacuation if it were to come to that?
Yep, excellent question. And before I let Dan answer for his aspect, I'll put in my MNRF 2 cents. And so for the MNRF, whenever we arrive to a wildland fire, same thing applies for Dan and his team. We assess it and see where it's going to burn and what values it's going to threaten. More often than not, we can suppress it before it threatens any values, and we have to pull the trigger on evacuation 9 times out of 10. In certain circumstances, we do have to pull evacuations. And actually, if you can think back to Pembroke 1, Centennial Lake, Calabogie fire, I don't know, that happened last year in June, in the beginning of June.
Right.
That's a really good example of that, right? Where we had a wildland fire that the no, it wasn't Greater Madawaska. What the heck was the fire department there? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Don't quote me on it. I was talking to them because I was the SRO. Doesn't matter. So that fire department was on scene. They let me know information. I got information. I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to look at an evacuation of the community, the cottage community to the north. Here's your points to work from. I'll leave that to you, Chief, to work with the OPP, and I'll keep you updated on what the fire's doing, and I'll do the suppression aspects of that. So for yourselves, and Dan's going to mention about it, is the social media aspect of when Dan notifies it and puts it out through the Dysart et al. Facebook page or social media page or any e-alerts. If you guys share that, that's tremendous. And with that, I'll leave it with Dan because then I'm kind of stepping on Dan's toes. So you go ahead, Dan, and speak to your aspect of it.
Not at all, Ken. Certainly you're quite accurate with that. Basically, what's going to happen as a fire department, we're going to be notified of a fire and we respond to it. And unless updates are coming before we arrive, which may be coming from MNRF, as we have that great relationship with them, and they only have a 3-minute flight time. So because of that, working together, we will have to factor in weather. What are the conditions? Are we already in a fire ban? All these things need to factor in. So wind, which direction is it pushing it? How fast is it going? What kind of fuel load is in this area for us to decide on what we need for resources right off the bat. So we'll be calling in MNRF specifically, but possibly neighboring fire departments. In your case, you are actually covered on behalf of Dysart by Highlands East Fire Department, and they would certainly call on us, and that gives us time to respond there to help out. So there's two municipal fire departments plus the MNRF already hopefully actively fighting that fire and hopefully successfully fighting that fire. But even before all that, of the fire itself, as if it is gaining intensity and we're not getting it, even with the smoke, is something that we would have to consider as far as when we decide whether we need to do an evacuation. So even if we're able to, or we feel we can contain the fire, smoke in itself is toxic and extremely hazardous. So all of those factors will have to come in mind. And as Kenny had mentioned, we make use of social media. In when possible, we'll even be going door to door if we have manpower to do that sort of thing. We reach out to the radio stations and we'll be putting word out there. And certainly, I mean, your neighborhood, I'm sure they already have some sort of communication systems, even just something coming out from your Harcourt Park Association, your board there. We would try and be in contact with them to get the word out as quickly as possible. Because we want to give people time to get out in a calm fashion. So if it does come to that, now, one thing we're going to ask you, if it does come to an evacuation ever, is to make sure you just take your absolute essentials. So, grab some medications, change your clothes, get out the door. If your pet has run away because it's concerned, please don't go searching for your pet. Like Kenny said, somehow or other, it's natural for animals to find sources and locations that they can hide successfully for. But if you've been asked to leave, please don't make any attempt to return. Now, that being said, it's going to be extremely, extremely severe before we get to the point where we have to do an evacuation. Luckily, because of the nature of our our forest, the deciduous trees and stuff like that. So we actually are extremely lucky for that kind of thing. That although we do get some fairly quick spreads, we've been very successful. In my year's experience, I've been with our department for almost 25 years now, and we have worked closely with the MNRF on several occasions and with neighboring departments, but we've never had any circumstance where I've even heard us even mentioning evacuations.
Okay.
Great stuff.
Right. So you've mentioned coniferous trees and are hemlocks bad? Now, we did lose a whole lot of hemlocks a few days ago. They're lying on the ground now. So I assume that, for our forest, obviously we can't, we've got 7,000 acres of land, but those hemlocks that are lying on the ground, I assume that it's very important that we clean those up.
Just
The ones on the ground, sorry.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. Sorry, Dan. You go ahead.
Well, I just say the ones on the ground are definitely hazardous. Again, that slash photo that Kenny had in there,
Right.
it's difficult for us to trip, it's a trip hazard from one thing, but then the materials get caught in between them. And even though it can slow the fire down, all those smaller materials in between allow it to build and make it difficult for us to get it, to get into those crevices and fully extinguish it as well. So.
Yeah. Prolonged resource commitments, right, Dan? We're on that thing for a lot longer trying to suppress it. But the essence is for you folks, instead of my humble recommendations are, and they're completely that, is not to worry about the forest surrounding your homes. More so look at just within the 100 feet or your what you own to manage. And I'm not telling you to go on any of your neighboring partners' properties and remove anything or touch their lands. Just work within your land basin that you have permissions to and you own. But if you just work on that immediate zone around the structure and work outwards from that, any of those hemlock tops or branches that have accumulated within those zones, those 3 zones, outwards a maximum of 100 feet, if you can remove those and get those further than 100 feet from your home, aka 30 meters, you can have a fire intensity class 5, fire intensity class at 5,500 kilojoules of heat, which is a lot of heat, right at the 100-foot mark, and you're not gonna lose your home. So at that instance, is anything past that 100-foot mark, 30-meter part, don't worry about that too much. Just worry about the structure itself and the immediate area right around the structure, if that helps resonate with folks too, and alleviate any concerns.
Okay, that's good. Do you have a few more minutes if others have questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. If anybody has a question, if you want to come off mute. Okay, I see Eric off mute. Do you want to go ahead?
Is that me?
Yeah, that's you. What's your name?
Eric. Okay, I got a quick question. It's going to take a second. Harcourt Park has always had some pumps available since the 60s. We have had Wajax Mark 26 pumps and Mark 3s. And a few years ago, they were swapped out for some smaller 4 horsepower Honda pumps. And part of the reason there is that the Mark III pumps are a little bit difficult to start for young people and old people like me and possibly some women. The Hondas are a lot easier to start. And they came with probably a polyethylene hose, a discharge hose, that could easily get damaged. I think when you're fighting a fire somewhere, a small forest fire or a fire on the side of the road or a cottage fire or anything like that. The old Wajax pumps had a combination of either lined or unlined hoses, and we still have some of them around here, but we don't have them available for use right now. What would the MNR use or local fire departments as far as discharge hoses? Would you use lined hoses or unlined hoses?
Well, we use for forestry, it's self-protecting hose. So it actually is lined now. The technology, in terms of the fire hose specific question, it's a lined hose, but it self-percolates. So it reduces friction loss, but also produces that old style, that style that you're talking about before, where it was unlined. It also percolates just like that, which self-protects it. With that being said, in terms of fire response, I humbly recommend anybody call 911 to report it to the authorities, to allow the authorities with the proper protective equipment and the communications aspect for the aviation side of things and the proper processes to deal with it. Pumps are totally fine. Everybody can have a pump if you can afford them. I know I certainly can't on my own personal budget, but if you want a pump on your cottage to protect it with a sprinkler system, you're more than welcome to. I just don't advise anybody to actively suppress a wildland fire because of the natural dangers associated with that. And also being when we respond to a fire, sometimes our air TAC does arrive there before crews on the ground arrive there in rare circumstances, but still often every summer they do. If they see people down there and they can't get a hold of them, they will not drop. They'll just leave that fire and continue going. So that's another attribute there of why I don't recommend anybody with non-firefighting training that's not part of a fire department like Dan's team or the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry or a First Nation community fire department. I recommend you stay back and call the authorities, make sure everybody's safe, and let us do our job in a humble aspect. Thanks, Eric. That's a good question, though.
That's a great question, Eric. Actually, I'd like to add to that too. So first of all, we use different combinations of hoses. We actually use the same hose the MNRF use for most of our forest fire fighting applications, and Wajax pumps we still use. But we also have the fully lined hose that we're on our trucks that we will use all the time theirs are actually for structure fires and car fires, and those are sort of our more normal response. And we can sort of combine those together and work with them. But my concern, as far as you having a pump, one, how often has it been maintained? Any of those hoses, have they been tested? Is they safe to use? Then the next start, you get into the liabilities of being on somebody else's property. If you have a pump, Kenny said, like you said, for yourself and you're protecting your own property, that's fine. We've run into this with lake associations. They, over the years, and I assume you're the similar type of situation here, where at one time there was a decision to go ahead and buy maybe several pumps and they're located around. Well, so are they being maintained? Is somebody properly trained in using them? And then do you have the permission to be on every person's property? Now, I'm not sure how Harcourt Park works. I understand it's all one parcel of land, so it's a little confusing for me. But generally speaking, you still have your own personal area, as far as I understand. So, are you allowed to be on somebody's area of property? And then you get back into the liability of, you're trying to actively fighting a fire for the neighbor and you trip and injure yourself. Well, in this day and age, you are told you pretty much have to sue them, even though you were there to try and help them and you've got hurt in their property. You are told you have to sue them in order to try and have some sort of financial backing to cover the rest of life. And I hate to be a naysayer in that because you were trying to do something positive for somebody else. But this is the realistically of things we're running into in this day and age. So, I mean, almost every second ad you hear on any radio station now is a lawyer. I can get money for you kind of thing. And it's really sad commentary, but that is something to be considered.
I think in our situation historically, for the last 60 years, forest fires in Harcourt Park have been extremely rare. And the forest fires that we have had have been extremely small, and they get noticed relatively quickly. And we've had tremendous success of getting these fires put out just using the small pumps that we have. Harcourt Park, currently we have 11 fire pumps available, scattered around our property, and they get maintained on a regular basis. Twice a year, those pumps are usually run and have the fuel changed in them regularly. We've been doing that since back in the 60s.
Well, that's wonderful, and that sounds like your association there is taking it in the right direction. That was more of a caution from my aspect. So
we have had structure fires in the past that have started for various reasons. We've had lightning strikes here. We've lost cottages throughout the year. Some of them have been in the wintertime, actually. Chimney fires have brought down cottages, and then some other electrical problems, I guess, in the buildings. And we've never really had any liability issues at all that I can think of.
well, I'm really glad to hear that.
I know that's a big fear
Yeah.
for many people. And back in the 70s, we had a cottage fire on Little Straggle Lake, and the MNR came in and actually gave us a lot of pointers trying to get this fire put out. The cottage was a total loss, but we had a couple of our pumps running, and the MNR brought a pump in and helped us out. It was great.
Well, that's interesting with the structure fire, the MNRF helped you in that case. But again, now it's one thing to use that for forest firefighting, and those, and again, smoke is hazardous. All smoke is hazardous, but the toxic smokes that come off of our current building structures, with all the plastics, Kenny said, like a sofa inside your house, if it happens to ignite that through, that's one of the methods for forest fires to take out a structure. Those are extremely hazardous, and they're known to be toxic. And that's something, I mean, as firefighters, that's why we have our SCBA masks to help give us fresh air, because there's cancer causing and carcinogens and stuff like that. So it's one thing for you to use that for forest fire protection and set up sort of a sprinkler system. It's another thing for you to be actively standing in that smoke from a building, stuff like that. And I'm going to recommend you don't do that.
Okay.
I think the main thing here is we call 911 and stay as far away, but maybe wet areas so it doesn't transfer from cottage to cottage. Can we do that type of thing, or should we not have pumps at all?
It sounds like you have a wonderful agreement there. The pumps are being maintained from what the information Eric's just told me. I'm not going to tell you to get rid of them. Certainly not. I again want to be cautionary about your usage of them and stuff. As far as a structure fire goes, certainly if you've got those pumps, I could see somebody actively spraying water onto the neighboring property to prevent it from spreading. But again, I mean, as much, I mean, if well, I don't know. I'm gonna tell you, I mean, human nature, what I think I would do and what I would actually do. But I know about the repercussions of breathing in those toxic smokes and stuff like that. So, I mean, want the best we can. I'm going to tell you, as a fire department, for me being responsible for my team, is we are coming to your house to try and make your day better, but not at a risk of harming ourselves. We have the equipment to do it in a more safe fashion. Unfortunately, firefighting is still inherently dangerous. But one of those things right after the fresh air in our air packs is one of the things right off the back that has made a major turning point for firefighting over the last 30 years kind of thing. So
all right, thank you.
Yeah, no, a lot of our policies have changed since that time too. So the MNRF will not suppress any structure fire or motor vehicle fire either anymore. Just to make everybody clear on that, we're forest fire only because of those safety concerns that Dan just pointed out. So thanks, everybody. I see Dale. Dale has his hand up.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's she. Sorry, surprise. I just wanted to point out that in Harcourt Park, we do have a managed forest plan. And according to our plan, half of the forest is deciduous, and it's mostly maple, sugar maple. And 30% is mixed forest. And like we have pockets of hemlocks here and there, but they tend to be disjunct. And a lot of that is beside water. And then we have a little bit of coniferous wetland. And so my take on this is that we are not at high risk for any kind of wildland fire. But we are hearing that the forest soils are getting drier. And so I have some concerns. We're about to have one of these EORN towers put on a height of land, and they're going to be taking off the canopy. So it's going to be exposing those soils. I'm recommending that they plant that up with native shrubs to try and shelter the soils. But then my real question is, what kind of risks do motorized vehicles on trails pose to these drying soils? Because there's a lot of litter there. Obviously, we're not cleaning that up. And I came across some comment that said sparks off of, oh, I guess it was your exhibit in Wilberforce had a little yellow thing that said, beware of ATV sparks. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the spark arresters. So most ATVs nowadays come with spark arresters. It's a little mesh screen embedded into the exhaust of an all-terrain vehicle, whether it be a dirt bike, whether it be a side-by-side, or of course an ATV. So those spark arresters, make sure that they're in place. If you have one, if you own and operate one of those off-road devices, because it's actually legislation to have one nowadays, including the chainsaws as well. But for us, it's very rare. I showed that screen up of the 2021 stats, and I can talk to the 2023 stats. For us, for an all-terrain vehicle or an off-road vehicle to start a fire, I have had them. By all means, they can once in a while, but it's very rare occurrences. Most often than not, for my experiences, it's a buildup of fine fuels that are wrapped around a drive shaft and the brake system that build up and build up and build up. And then when somebody's been using it all day, it heats up to a point where it actually starts to ember, falls off, and is smoldering after they've gone down the trail and didn't notice that they left smoldering material there that started a forest fire on a couple occasions, but very rare. It's not very often that I get those type of calls. And Dan, you can speak to it as well too, if you like.
Yes, I wouldn't mind there. I think part of that too is how well are these trails used? It's been my experience, like most trails that if they're well used, they're almost bare dirt almost all the time. So there's not the fine fuels aren't there on the trail itself so much. Maybe if somebody was, off-roading a little bit and got into some long grass, the edge of a marsh or something like that, it would be more susceptible to that sort of spread. So again, with the spark arresters, as Kenny mentioned, that there's very limited that could happen.
Yeah, we've got a mix of trails, and I know there's even motorized bikes that go off trails and just anywhere they want to go. And so they're breaking trails. So that's why the concern.
That's a good concern, Dale.
All right. Does anybody else have a question? No, I think we're good. Well, thank you so much, Ken and Dan. That was a lot of great information, and we'll make sure that we share this recording as well as the link to Fire Smart Canada with the membership.
Well, thank you everyone for coming out and sharing your time with us as well. And really, really thanks to Ken. He did all the work here. He does a fabulous job. But you have our contact information. If there's any other questions that come up, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night,
Have a safe
everyone.
summer. Have a safe summer, everybody.
Bye-bye.